The truth is, I'm a long-term optimist because I'm optimistic about humankind. I'm a short-term pessimist because human beings are such political animals. I believe that the excesses of 40 years of artificially low interest rates and artificially induced liquidity and systematic overregulation and systematic faith by the citizenry in the government will probably cause us 3 or 4 very hard years, not too far in the future. I believe that the damage will be, like Warren Buffett would say, severe but survivable. And I intend to invest aggressively towards that period of time because I think there are certain demographic trends around the world, including, and I don't want to sound too woke, inclusion of women in the labor force and increasing internationalization of the workforce through both technology and communications mediums. So while I see the intermediate and longer term future of humankind as very bright, I think we have a reckoning to go through to get there. Rising interest rates, which need to happen, by the way, affects every sector of society. If you revert to mean just in the United States market, the U.S. 10-year Treasury has traded for a positive real yield, which is to say the yield on the U.S. 10-year Treasury has been in excess of the CPI rate. If the CPI rate is, as Congress states it, at 9%, that would suggest that the 10-year Treasury should be yielding 10% as opposed to 4%. The 30-year fixed mortgage has traditionally traded above the U.S. 10-year, which would suggest 30-year fixed mortgage rate at 10.5 or 11. Can you imagine the impact on house prices and house affordability? On the other hand, credit markets are supposed to reward savers. The manipulated credit markets that we've seen in the United States for the last 40 years really are a manifestation of a political war, a war by the politicians on the savers for the benefit of spenders. You do not spend your way to prosperity, you save your way to prosperity. So I see that being problematic. I see too, not just in the US market, but around the world, an increasing share of GDP going to the collective. For most working Americans, the cost of their government, federal, state, and local, exceeds the cost of shelter, food, and energy combined. Obviously, the more you take for the center, the less you leave for the family. A very, very, very poor trend from my point of view. It would be highly amusing if the federal government gave a T-bill auction and nobody showed up. That is to say that the idea that you get paid 4% in a currency that's depreciating by 9%, in other words, that you assign to the federal government 5% of your purchasing power every year for 10 years, it's odd that people see that as a viable option. I think the first time they gave a treasury auction, nobody showed, that would send some very broad shocks through the political system and the economic system. It would be ugly for bond markets. It would be ugly for equities markets. It would drain for a while liquidity out of all financial markets. It would literally shock the hell out of everybody concerned. Would it create a better future? Or would the voters cause the political classes to resume not selling treasuries at all, but rather counterfeiting, which is to say quantitative easing, printing their own money without having to borrow it from savers? In most Western economies, the demographics are becoming less good, which is to say that the population is becoming older and the structures are becoming more rigid and more stratified. What I really like that I see is that in the last 40 years, labor force participation, as an example, by women has doubled. The idea that somehow in my youth, society had the view that all good ideas came from old, bald, fat white guys, I think was harmful. And I think labor force participation among women is a great thing. I think, too, that the benefits of education and the benefits of communication means that we will see much greater participation from emerging and frontier markets. One of the things that society doesn't give itself credit for over the last 40 years is the incredible feat of taking 1.5 billion people out of abject poverty. When I look back over 40 years and I think about what has caused me optimism, it's the fact that despite our collective idiocy, our individual initiative, persistence, tenacity, brilliance, is such that 4 or 5 young kids can take over a garage in Sunnyvale, California, and out pops Google, or out pops Facebook, or out pops Apple. That's just a wonderful set of circumstances. A group of young people can get together and still change the entire world. What's really hopeful to me is that as a consequence of distributed education and communications technology, when you think about the fact that the world is opening up opportunity to almost 8 billion people, as opposed to the old club that was afforded opportunity when I broke into business, you almost can't help but be optimistic.
When it comes to energy, like what are the things that are most top of mind for you today?
I don't want to come across as being anti-alternative or so-called green energy. There are about 1.2 billion people in the world that have no access to electricity. They want to live like you and I do. There are another 2 billion people on Earth who only have access to intermittent or unaffordable energy. They too want to live like you and I do. Do we need more wind power? Absolutely. How about solar? Yes, indeed. Geothermal, let's have that too. Hydro, that too. And then energy that is cheap, dense, and works on a broad scale, which is to say nuclear, oil, gas, and coal. We need all of the above. My belief is that despite the protests of the big thinkers, the Bidens, the Trudeaus, the Merkels, that noted energy physicist Greta Thunberg, that peak oil demand will occur somewhere between 2040 and 2045. It's interesting to note that several $trillion have been spent in the last 20 years on various forms of alternative energy, and the market share of hydrocarbons has fallen from 82% to 81%, which is to say an investment of $3 trillion reduced our demand for oil and gas by 1%. We need to rethink lots about our energy policies.
Do you think people are going to start to wake up to the idea that, like, yes, you need fossil fuels now to kind of give you the bridge to even get to the alternatives where they're more viable at scale? Like, what do you think?
I think people are waking up to that. You've seen popular protests around Europe around the rising cost of living, including energy. You've even seen Greta Thunberg saying that the Germans can't shut down their nuclear plants. That doesn't mean, by the way, that in places like Spain or Italy, where the sun shines, that you shouldn't build big solar arrays, particularly on top of warehouses and, discount centers like Costco, where that sun can provide basically free energy for air conditioning during very hot periods of time. But it does mean that places like Germany and Sweden, places that are in the far north where the sun doesn't shine, probably shouldn't put most of their energy future in things like solar. My suspicion is that the world has been through a very prosperous 40 years, and that has enabled us to retreat from arithmetic and physics to narrative. It allowed us to buy into some very fanciful, although very attractive, fairy tales. And my suspicion is that this period of excess prosperity is probably unwinding. And the consequence of that is that, again, I believe that there will be a retreat to arithmetic, to physics, to engineering, and a retreat away from narrative, however pleasant that narrative might be.